Well, I certainly do, yes, as a European, also as a Portuguese, and basically I would say as a Westerner, that is a member of the Western civilization and alliance. I see Europe as the birthplace of a Western civilization of liberty and personal responsibility, and I see that Western tradition mainly based in the Atlantic Alliance, on the Atlantic Alliance between Europe and the United States, Canada, and part of the broader Western liberal democratic tradition. I think the most crucial reference, not in my living memory, but that was very present in my parents' home and grandparents' homes, was D-Day, June 1944. Of course, I was not born at that time, but even the images, newspapers that was kept in my parents' houses that moment were very present in daily conversations, at the dinner table, and so the idea of the D-Day, the liberation, or the beginning of the liberation of Europe from Nazi tyranny and occupation, was a sort of crucial reference in my house, my parents' and grandparents' house. So that, and that was, certainly associated with, crucially, with liberation of Europe, but it's also interesting, I think, and it's probably related to my first answer, that D-Day you had, you had some Polish troops, you had some French troops, but it was mainly an operation based on British, American, Canadian too, I think. Mm-hmm. So, since the very beginning at my sort of family education, Europe was always associated with the Atlantic and the support that we received from the Americans and the resistance of Britain. Worst moment in recent European history, I don't really see a particularly bad moment. There have been, of course, periods of difficulties, crises, tensions, but compared to what we have had before, I don't see really any tremendously bad moment in recent European year. By recent, I mean after the Second World War, after the end of the Second World War. Compared to the Second World War, or compared to the First World War, I think, fortunately, we have been quite fortunate to have lived through free times and times of freedom and democracy, especially, of course, after the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, which I think that after the end, it was in fact the sort of complete completion of the victory, of the Allied victory in the Second World War. 1945, 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall sort of marks the completion of that victory, because, as we know, 1945 was the victory against Nazism, but in fact 1989 was the victory against communism. So since then, since 1945 in the West, in Western Europe, since 1989 in Central and Eastern Europe and in Europe as a whole, I don't think we have had, we have problems, tensions with Russia, that is worrying. But still, compared to what we have had before, I think these have been happy times, as Dahrendorf used to say, happy times to be alive. Well, certainly the fall of the Berlin Wall, 1989, yeah. As I said, yes. So that was as I said before, so in fact the victory, the victory of liberal democracy in 1945 was a partial victory. It was only a victory over one of the enemies. Then, as we know, we had Central and Eastern Europe have remained occupied by the Soviet Union. And for that reason, I would certainly say that the best or the most happy moment in recent European history was the fall of the Berlin Wall, yeah, without any doubt. I have no idea. I mean, I've been a supporter of the European Union since a long time, and I was very happy when Portugal entered the European community at the time. Because, by the way, the fact that Portugal was not a member of the European community was associated to the fact, I think the most important reason was that Portugal was not a democracy until 1974. So we were allowed to join only after that, and the process took quite a while. It was 1985, 86 that we joined. We were accepted. So that was, as a Portuguese, maybe I would say that was the most important moment. For me personally, well, if you want to take that personally in a broad sense, I would then say the most important moment was the fact that Portugal was allowed to join. First of all, that continues to exist peacefully and within a general atmosphere of prosperity, but perhaps associated with that, I would say, I would recommend, well, not recommend, but I would like that the European project could become more flexible, broad-minded, let's say liberal-minded, and namely this idea, and perhaps put aside the idea of an ever closer union as the only. I'm not saying people. There are people who think that the European Union should always be more integrated, and that's okay. That some people, I don't subscribe to that view, but they're entitled to have that view. What I'm saying, so I'm not saying abolishing that view. What I'm saying is, I think we should not take that view, that ever closer union, always more integrated, as the the only possible way ahead, and certainly not the meaning of being Europeanist, having to be in favor of that. I don't agree with that. I think people are entitled to have that view. To be in favor of a more integrated Europe, certainly. We are a liberal democracy, so people are entitled to have different views. But precisely because of that, people are also entitled to disagree with that view. And this idea of creating a sort of constitutional dogma that if you are in favor of the European Union, you have to be in favor of an ever closer union, what they usually say, more Europe, always more Europe. That's the expression. I don't agree with that. And but it's not only a question of disagreeing. I think that is not, good. It's for the European project. Why? Because it narrows the European project, and makes it a sort of sectarian. Instead of being a broad pluralist project, flexible and within which you can have different views, rival views competing with one another. The idea of Europe being necessarily ever closer, in fact, narrows the range of European views that are possible. And in that sense, I don't think that's good for the European project. So if you ask me what, I mean, that would be, certainly would be a long conversation, but I mean, if there, I have a main concern about this tendency to identify the European project with a particular view. And by the way, if we compare that with what we have in our liberal democracies, that's not what we have in our liberal democracies. We usually have at least, we need two parties at least, and we have more, and usually we have more. And so the idea that you need a sort of uniformity of views about the sort of end state to be achieved, I don't think that's good.
If I may elaborate on this final question, do you think that there are particular policies or policy topics that the European Union is particularly well suited as a supranational organization to lead on and to set as an example for the rest of the world? For instance, climate or security. Or do you think that those matters could be...
I think the main point of the European Union, and you said supranational institution?
Supranational.
Supranational, yeah. Well, I wouldn't... I wouldn't be a great enthusiast of the idea of a European Union as a supranational institution. I think European Union is basically based on nation states, coalition of nation states, which are liberal democracies, and that is the main foundation.
But even as it is, sorry to interrupt you, even as it is...
So I wouldn't call it supranational, that's my only point. And I don't think, I'm not particularly fond of the idea that European Union as such should lead this or should lead that. I think the main point of the European Union is to promote cooperation, competition, healthy market competition within the nations of Europe. So I'm not particularly enthusiastic about specific policy. I mean, I'm a great supporter of policies that promote interaction, free interaction between the nations and the peoples of Europe. But the idea of having much more than that, I think that policies should be mainly the responsibility of the national parliaments and not the supranational. So I like Ralph Dahrendorf used to say that he was not a Eurosceptic, which I'm not either, but he was not a Euro enthusiast either. I think that, so he was not an Eurosceptic and he was not an Euro enthusiast. So what was he? And that was his own description. He was a skeptical Europeanist. And I entirely subscribe to that view, and I think I learned a lot from Dahrendorf, of course, and I subscribe to that view. I'm also not an Eurosceptic, I'm not an Euro enthusiast either, and I would be happy to be defined as a skeptical Europeanist. And by the way, another point that Dahrendorf emphasized was that if we, let's say, narrow too much the understanding of the European project in terms of this Euro enthusiasm and Euro federalism or supranational institution, what you may get as an unintended consequence of that, what one can get is a strong reaction, nationalistic reaction, and perhaps we are witnessing elements of that. But But I mean, I wouldn't subscribe to the view that the only culprit of this is nationalism. I think there is another culprit, which is what I would call vanguardism, the idea that the nation state is something that must be superseded, that's only for unenlightened people or uneducated people. I don't subscribe to that, and I think we are creating or fostering or allowing to be created what also Dahrendorf called unfortunate dichotomies between nationalism and supranationalism. If you ask me which side I take, no. I'm not a nationalist, but I'm not a supranationalist either, and I think we should avoid that unfortunate dichotomy.
And would you avoid labeling your view altogether, or?
I would label my view as skeptical Europeanist.
Very good.
Which means I fully recognize and respect and defend the nation state as and national parliaments as the basis of democracy. That's the only basis we have tested. I'm not saying it's the only basis that can be. I don't know about the future, and I think the future is open. Nobody knows what the future will be. And but something is for sure. Liberal democracy, as we have experienced it, has always been based on nation states and national parliaments. We shouldn't play games with that. But that does not mean we cannot and should not cooperate. And actually the history of liberal democracies has also been the history of cooperation. And we should be in favor of that. So that's and free trade and